Hello, today is Thursday, December 19th, 2024. I'm Tony Mangino from TC2, and this is Staying Connected. On today's episode, we're going to discuss what continues to be a significant challenge for enterprises as they negotiate and procure ICT services. This is the online terms and service guides. And I'm joined today by LB3 partners Laura McDonald and Deb Bowling. Both Deb and Laura have years of experience assisting enterprise customers with their ICT deals and are here to discuss this challenge and some best practices for dealing with it. Laura, Deb, welcome. I'm looking forward to this particular discussion about these terms. Now, I'm most familiar with the service guides with respect to the telcos, but what you're seeing and what we're going to talk about today is issue of similar online terms for other ICT providers and services. So my first question is this something new?
Tony, yes and no. How's that for a lawyer answer? The telco service guides originated in the early 2000s with the advent of de-tariffing, and they now have a life of their own, and they're still going strong, as you mentioned. At this point, most enterprises are aware that they exist and are hopefully addressing them in their contracts and evaluations. But as you noted, today, Deb and I really want to focus on the concept of online terms, which really go beyond the simple acceptable use or, privacy policies of old that have kind of infiltrated or been built up by the ICT providers. And this is everyone from Avaya to Zscaler, and many in between, including Cisco, Genesys, NICE, Palo Alto, you name it. We're finding that the non-traditional telcos are adopting and using online terms similar to the telcos. Some are better and some are worse, but enterprise customers are less aware of their presence and the depth of their application.
Thanks, Laura. And Tony, great to be on Staying Connected again. Laura's right. The pervasive nature of online terms is impacting all types of ICT deals. And we appreciate this opportunity to flag this issue and hopefully provide some useful tips to our listeners.
All right. So, Deb, can you give me a few examples?
Sure. But before I can give examples, I want to warn our listeners. First, the vendor's online terms are hard to find, even for me and Laura. Looking at the vendor's homepage will only lead to frustration. You may find terms of service or legal links at the bottom of that, and eventually you may lead you to the contract documents. Instead, a web search for vendor master agreement, master terms, service agreement, service terms, subscription agreement, subscription terms, or terms of service is often more successful. But you see how long that list of terms is. And this is not limited to the end-user license agreement with which folks are often familiar. The results of the web search will typically get you closer to what you need as the starting point from the master services agreement level. And if you're a Lumen Telecom customer looking for Lumen contract terms, you know the difficulties of tracking the terms down. In retrospect, AT&T and Verizon did a decent job of presenting and organizing contractual information relevant to their services. Second, once you find the terms, it may be too late. Most, including Netscope, Cisco, Palo Alto, and most EULAs or EULAs, say if you use the services, you accept and are automatically bound to the terms. It's your typical click-through agreement, but without the actual click-through required. This undoubtedly contributes to the extent of shadow IT and often thousands of shadow apps that enterprises need to address. The specific online terms differ between vendors, but they all include significant limitations on the customer's use of the services and on the vendor's liability. This is particularly true of evaluation or free or trial period services. And while your organization may be great at due diligence for go-forward services, business units may sign up to see how it goes before initiating a formal procurement process, not to mention the risk of rogue employees. That can place the organization at risk, particularly if production data is used.
Deb, you're so on point. And in particular, I can vouch for the fact you can double your gray hairs in just locating the terms. So folks, please feel free to reach out to any of us and we'll try and point you in the right direction.
Thanks. So it sounds like customers need to follow the advice LB3 and TC2 have given for years. If it's important, put it in the contract.
Exactly. And there be some things that you didn't think about putting in the contract that the vendors catch you on in their online terms. For example, unless the customer or Salesforce says no at least 30 days in advance, Salesforce contracts automatically renew for a 12-month period at Salesforce's then current list rates. Remaining silent about renewal rights will not serve you. Beyond that, vendors typically include unilateral rights to suspend services immediately and without notice, in my book, without reasonable justification. Some vendors make this a little obvious by labeling the clause suspension. That'll catch your attention. Others, however, slipped it under a clause defining their, quote, responsibilities. Not sure when suspending your service should be their responsibility. And while vendors may offer to protect customers against claims that the customer infringed a third party's intellectual property rights, some then require the customer to represent and warrant that its use of the services complies with all applicable laws, thereby undermining the offered IP indemnity. I could go on, but you've heard me enough.
Deb, those are great examples. And at the risk of going on, I just want to point out a few more that folks should keep an eye out for. Watch for exclusive remedies, for example, in SLAs or indemnifications. And if you're worried about AI, make sure you're checking the online terms for that as well. Tony, in a prior podcast, we talked about the challenges and opportunities of AI in the CCaaS world. So that's an area in particular that folks should review the online terms. For example, if you go online and look at NICE's standard terms and conditions, they state that they govern all transaction documents, and they have a provision limiting customers' right to directly or indirectly use Gen AI to model, replicate, or use the services or software in any manner for any purposes for training AI technology. So if that's something you'd plan to do, you need to be aware of that. And to Deb's point about renewals, I also see online terms that have auto renewal provisions with built-in rate increases. So keep an eye out.
Okay, so if an enterprise has a contract, and since these don't have a regulatory origin and they're usually large purchasers, can't they just have the contract govern? Why do enterprises even have to worry about these online terms?
Tony, as usual, you're pointing in the right direction. In most cases, the best practice would be to have all the rates and terms set out in the four corners of the contract. In reality, just like telecom to some extent, that's hard to do. There are legitimate and not so legitimate reasons vendors want their online terms to apply. From their perspective, why not just have one acceptable use policy and privacy policy and other terms that apply to all customers with the right to update those terms unilaterally? That way, if laws change, circumstances change, or even if internal policies change, they can make one change that applies to everyone and not have to worry about tracking down which contracts need updating. However, most enterprises have their critical terms, such as their own AI, ML, data security, and privacy policies, and they enter deals understanding that the negotiated terms will apply and their policies will be consistent across their vendors.
You know, Deb, you've articulated what I hear from vendors all the time and how most enterprises feel about this issue. And while I have a modicum of sympathy for the vendors, enterprises purchase from hundreds of vendors and are not set up to monitor all these vendors' online terms and check for changes and determine the impact of those changes. So it goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway. Just because we've mentioned vendors, it doesn't mean that they all slip in online terms or insist on them, but they do exist and they can be both helpful and hurtful. So in looking at that, there are a couple things I'd recommend. First, be proactive and address this phenomenon up front. If you're doing a competitive procurement rather through an RFP, RFI, or less formal mechanism, start out by stating no online terms apply and include that in your contract. In fact, I'd do before that, I'd go and look yourself and see what they're there. I'll give you a little bit of a starting pad. Then if vendors come back and they don't want to take that position, they take a position that they have to apply, then there are other protections, and I can go over those in a second if you'd like. You need to make sure it's clear what does apply. Going back to Deb's point of it's difficult to find them and identify what products they go to. Also, when doing your due diligence, you need to make sure that the online rates don't supplement or modify your pricing terms. You might see these add-on fees appearing as necessary features that you have to buy but aren't in your contract that you didn't take into account, or extra surcharges that probably shouldn't apply. Remember, the type of ICT providers we're talking about here are not subject to the same regulatory overlay, and so you shouldn't be seeing the same type of regulatory fees that you'd see in your traditional telco agreement. And you also have to look out for those price increases that might appear through, as Deb and I pointed out, renewals or through COLA increases on a regular basis, or commitments that are associated or tiers. So those are all things to look at when you're looking at these online terms. You can best control the risk if you're informed and proactive.
Laura, what are those additional protections you mentioned?
Thanks for the reminder. There are a couple of ways to address online terms and contracts, and it's going to vary depending on the vendor and their response to the things I just noted above. But before I even go there, just a reminder, make sure whatever you have in your contract, it applies not only to the contract when you sign it, but anything you add on to it, any SOWs or orders or attachments. But going back to the question, first, if you've gotten them to agree that no online terms apply, then state that clearly in your contract, including click-through. Second, if you don't get that, you might want to allow some limited online related terms, but you have to review and vet those in advance and put in provisions that negotiated terms override any non-negotiated terms. Third, prevent changes to those online terms. Some providers are amenable to having the terms as attachments. So they may be their online terms, but instead of going online to look at them, they're actually part of your agreement, and then you can vet them and redline them as you need. But if they won't agree to that and they're insisting on online terms, try and either freeze the terms as the date you sign it so you don't have to keep track of it, or if they're not frozen, require meaningful notice and remedies and time for those remedies if the changes are material and adverse. We have a pretty good feel for the way that the provider's response is going to be to these, but it goes without saying, if you don't ask, you won't get it. And if you don't have leverage, your success rate is not going to be great.
Deb, what's your experience with the embedded terms? How much work does it take to really vet them?
Well, Tony, thank you for that question. It's a really good question. And Laura's approaches will help mitigate or reduce the amount of online terms that you need to look at. But if you're doing your upfront due diligence, the answer is going to be it depends. Let's take Netskope. Currently, its subscription services agreement and its online terms appear very straightforward. The agreement and the online terms are only 8 pages long, and they're limited to standard clauses like the parties' responsibilities, fees, confidentiality, warranties, disclaimers, and limitations on liability, with a limited number of hyperlinks to other terms. But don't be misled. That services agreement has capitalized terms such as implementation services description document that refer to other terms that are, quote, provided by Netskope, close quote, and there's no hyperlink. This lack of hyperlinks leaves more documents to search for, typically through your account team, who will have no clue. Some vendors, like Salesforce, Cisco, and Smarsh, create a spider web of links and terms that are hard to ferret out and review. But that type of diligence is critical because you will find things like extremely short periods after expiration or termination to extract your data. And this isn't telecom, so you have data to extract in most of these deals. In one strange case, approvals had to be provided in writing, in person, or by overnight mail.
Tony, Deb is spot on. And this isn't just limited terms. As I discussed earlier, you'll find that the vendors rely on their online URLs for pricing and fees or options. And as I alluded to before, it actually can be helpful to go and look at these in advance because it gives you a baseline to evaluate and compare vendors. For example, Genesys has a cloud summarized plan comparison that lists what features are in the various options and what you can add on if needed. So knowing that in advance will help you determine what you want and to seek the best pricing and terms.
Thanks, Deb and Laura, for a really engaging discussion today.
You're welcome. Our pleasure.
Have a great new year.
Thanks to you both. I second those wishes to all of our listeners. And if you'd like to talk to Deb, Laura, me, or any of our LB3 and TC2 colleagues about the online guides or any of your ICT contracting needs, please give us a call or send us an email. You can also stay up to date by subscribing to Staying Connected, by checking out our websites, and by following us on LinkedIn.